Well, greetings. I'm Dr. Dean Blevins, and welcome to this open sort of orientation video to PTH 520, Congregational Formation and Discipleship, where we are going to kind of unpack the major goal of the class by understanding that what we're engaging with in this class is really trying to make sense of congregational formation and discipleship through pastors' eyes. And that we're really trying to unlock the church through congregational discernment as we move into congregational discipleship. And that's a large part of what this course is intended to do, particularly starting out at the very beginning of the class as we begin. So I did want to talk about the way we sort of make sense of congregations or even other ministry organizations by looking at it through sort of three different pastoral levels. And yes, I'm going to use the letter P a lot. Alliteration is not my gift, and definitely not something I use a lot of times in preaching. But I think it might be helpful, even as we engage a local congregation, to understand that these pastoral levels include the program level, the processes, and then the personality or family resemblance of a given congregation. Now, the most basic one is the program level, and it's probably one you know very well because it's the elements of the various programs in the church and the resources, the curricular resources that sort of guide it. And most of the time, you can identify the programs through a flowchart, Excel file. Sometimes it's based on the different levels of leadership and church committees that you might have. And most pastors and even people attending a church may not know all the programs, but they do tend to identify pretty quickly programs as their name. So yes, they can be age level ministries with women or men in mind, missions, but also missions education. It's really those kind of core units that just make up the basic anatomy of a congregation. They sort of define the different elements of the skeletal system that we have. It may be, a lot of times just the anatomical parts, if you will, that comprise that congregation. And you could create a laundry list and walk through those. But as you do that, and depending on the size of church, that could be pretty daunting, or it might be pretty basic. You're really getting at sort of the core anatomy of a given congregation. But that's not all that's going on, because those different parts of the anatomy fit together. And in doing so, that process of fitting together, that is the processes that often sort of guide the whole flow of that anatomical system as you kind of understand how the body begins to work from the inside out. So one way to think about it is that we are more than just, body parts, but it's the connectedness, the sinews and the energy and the tonal qualities of that anatomy that make up who we are. And in a way, we're going to sort of think about that by taking a systematic approach to the church's education through more non-formal categories. And you'll get those in the reading as we go along. But we're looking for those sort of implicit processes sometimes, and sometimes the leadership and how that guides those different parts and coordinates those is one way to think about how we understand them and how those processes can be organized and linked together as systems, if you will, to help us understand better how the different parts, the different program parts connect together as the church does its formation and discipleship. And finally, we want to talk about the personality of a given congregation. We all have bodies and we all have a certain look, but it's amazing how, anytime you go to if you ever go to a family reunion, you start noticing that people do tend to kind of look like each other sometimes. And we are, in some ways, trying to consider the sort of the view of the congregation as a whole, and how by taking a kind of comparative view, looking at that church as a whole, how it understands its discipleship, kind of out of its personality, how that might connect to other kinds of churches that may have a similar posture. So one way to think about this is you might have two different churches with a similar mission statement, but they may have really sort of different personalities. And as a result of it, how they live out that mission statement may be more consistent with their family and their family resemblances. Family resemblances can include things like, the proximity of churches in certain areas, like suburban churches compared to urban churches. can include sort of denominational characteristics that fit, though I think many of us have sometimes, particularly if you've ever gone to a large denominational gathering, might be surprised to find a church, say, from the West Coast and one from the Midwest meeting and looking at each other going, you mean you're part of the same denomination as we are? So sometimes the family resemblances may be a bit odd if you just merely think about denominational alignment, or even sometimes even urban and suburban alignment. But usually there are certain kinds of family resemblances. And inside those resemblances, inside that personality, normally resides a kind of implicit theology. Now, in the class, we'll talk about theology explicitly, and many churches, again, might even name their theology through a mission statement or through a denominational tradition. But when that congregation sort of lives its life together, that theology may get nuanced quite a bit. And what they say, as opposed to how they understand themselves, may be a bit of a challenge before it's over with. And by naming that, I'm already pushing toward the other thing. It's enough to begin with to know what are the programs, begin to sort of identify the kind of core processes that are going on, and sort of name the personality of a congregation. But we do want to attend to gaps as a part of this course. And so when you're looking at programs, you might want to be considering, but what about the resources and the policies in place to make them happen? And how well are those programs operating? And are they lacking resources, or are they missing policies? For instance, you may have a very robust children's ministry program, but if you don't have a child safety policy, you could be setting yourself up for a real problem down the road. Or you may have a kind of neat looking evangelistic strategy on paper, but if there aren't resources to guide that evangelistic strategy that really trains people, then you really don't have a program that's working in evangelism. There may be more informal processes going on in evangelism instead. Now that pushed me to the second piece, which is the processes. And here it really is important, not merely the specific programs, but where does the ministry occur, and how often is it done in non-formal or informally as much as it is done formally? So since I've alluded to evangelism, is evangelism a formal program, or is it more a kind of non-formal sort of representation of the congregation as a whole, or is it more informally conducted at certain key events within the life of the congregation, where the congregation tends to be more inviting to others, but maybe other places less so? That's how you begin to kind of think about how the different programs relate to each other. Now, these processes include, different ways in which the church as a whole sort of works together to shape and form people, for instance. Does formation happen just in Sunday school classes, or does it really happen also within the life of worship? And might it happen also as people gather informally somewhere? And how do you hold, a specific class, maybe that's a very intentional discipleship class, a beginner's class, and the life of worship in a congregation, and it's non-formal gathering together, and understand how all three of those either work together to form people, or are they sometimes sort of working against each other? Processes also includes the human element within a congregation. I always have a kind of famous one I talk about, and this is, who owns in your church, particularly if it's a small church, who owns the church kitchen? You may think there's a stewardship committee, or even a hospitality committee that oversees the kitchen, but we all know that really Aunt Bertha runs the kitchen. And there may be lots of plans and strategies, but if you don't have Aunt Bertha on board, then, nothing really moves in that kitchen until she signs on. And so sometimes that informal leadership. And anybody who's ever run a youth group and tried to use the kitchen for an event without getting Aunt Bertha's blessing knows exactly what I'm talking about. It could become an awkward moment, even in a well-planned youth program, just because you haven't attended to the non-formal processes within the leadership structure, as well as the ways in which that event connects maybe to youth discipleship and even worship, and how you're hoping that those elements of programming go together in the processes of what you're trying to accomplish. Again, we'll have more readings to help us organize processes as we go along. And finally, we do need to pay attention to gaps when it comes to the personality of a congregation. particularly how the congregation perceives the church's educational task, a kind of working theology of discipleship. Because I think sometimes we'll find that theology is often, well, erratic or episodic, and maybe because people come from different congregational backgrounds, their assumptions about what's important about discipleship may be quite different. And the congregation, even if it's got a kind of smooth discipleship mission statement, may realize that, well, not everybody really understands how it works within this given congregation, particularly if it's a smaller church and you're trying to improve on that. And so, are there places where you need to at least make the theology more clear to try to bring people together? Or is it important to identify that within a given sort of personality of a congregation, that no matter how you think you are controlling the theology, there's nevertheless a kind of implicit theology also at work that you have to come alongside and try to work both within and try to improve as you go along. So we're going to be talking about programs and processes and personality, but as you walk through a church, pay attention to the gaps as well. Now, as we continue to move forward, just understanding the course that when it comes to generalizing, particularly some of these components, we'll have lots of resources in the class. So when it comes to those anatomical systems of a congregation, sort of understanding the congregation from the inside out, you'll find that there have been a lot of people have been trying to sort of name those internal processes through different interpretive lenses. And so sometimes it's through sociological approaches. And there's actually a really good website called Studying Congregations that can help you if you want to engage the church that way. There have been people who have been trying to make sense of congregations from a biblical perspective. So Walter Brueggemann, for instance, has talked about how a church is engaged in Torah or the forming, and how the wisdom literature is about discerning, and how the prophetic literature is about transforming, and the Psalms are about worship. And how is it that a church is engaged in forming and guiding and discerning and taking a prophetic stance and a transforming posture and leading people into worship through Psalms? And could that kind of biblical template, if you will, help you understand how different programs connect to each other? There have been others. Maria Harris has talked about an ecclesial organization. It sounds a lot similar, where she looks at the early church, and she says the church is organized out of worship, discipleship, community, service, and proclamation. And there have been others that you'll read specifically in the class. For instance, Edie and Lamport think that to nurture faith in this day and age, churches must bring these processes around meaningful commemorations, mutual disclosure, general humility, intentional discipleship, faithful gestures, probing reflection. And yes, when you read the book that Mark Maddox and I wrote, we'll talk about a Wesleyan emphasis on formation and discernment and transformation. Now, let me say, all of the ones I've mentioned, outside of maybe the website, will show up in our readings in the class. So you'll get those unpacked. I'm not asking you to use all of them, but what is the best sort of template, if you will, to make sense of your congregation from the inside out? And which of these sort of resonate as how you hold different programs together and understand the flow of them, and even what leadership looks like in light of those? That's one way to kind of understand what we'll be doing in the class. As a matter of fact, there are 3 books I'll highly recommend as we go along, and their organizing principles. I've already mentioned Nurturing Faith, which has their own sort of 6 basic categories to understand how the different programs connect to each other through the processes to understand what Nurturing Faith looks like. And in the book that you'll be reading for the class that comes from myself and Mark Maddox, we've sort of boiled those down to 3 in particular: formation, discernment, and transformation. So you might want to think, well, 6 categories, but it seems pretty big. That's sort of Papa Bear. 3 categories may be helpful, hope so, but maybe too simplistic. That may be more Baby Bear and the story of the 3 bears. So what would Mama Bear look like? Well, there's a book I'm not requiring by Charles Foster, but it's easy to access and it's not that expensive, titled Educating Congregations. And it's a kind of book that really does the same thing with exercises in it that basically says, really you can make sense of the processes of a church and the way in which it sort of accomplishes these 4 sort of goals or elements, so that it provides events that are transformative and foster unpacks those. It builds community. It helps Christians make meaning, and it nurtures hope through engagement in the world around themselves. And Foster provides those four categories, and they are pretty helpful. So I'm just going to mention them, that if the other sort of descriptors don't feel comfortable to you, there's at least one other resource that I have used at times in the past. It's just in this class, since you already have two approaches that include all the ones I've already mentioned, just not haven't included that this time around in this course. The other thing is generalizing the outside in, those family resemblances. And we'll discover in the class, and there are other books that have tended to do this. Avery Dulles has probably got the most famous version of this, where he takes a kind of theological approach, albeit from within a Catholic sort of orientation, since he became an archbishop as well as a theologian within that tradition. And he talks about churches that really rely on the institutional quality to provide that discipleship. Others tend to rely on a sense of mystical communion. Some tend to be more sacramental. Others focus on heralding, and in doing so, proclaiming. Others are more servant orientation. And finally, as a sixth category that talks about churches that just see themselves collectively as disciples. There are other books that do the same kind of thing when you think about it, that are available to you. You don't have to read them in this class, but it's the same kind of generalizing, where in the book Energizing the Congregation, Dudley and Johnson talk about churches that tend to be more, well, survivor-oriented kinds of churches, or others that, and their goal is to sort of weather the journey that they've been engaged in. While there are other churches that are just sort of understanding themselves through a sort of prophetic lens. There are those that are more pillar churches. They see themselves as sort of an anchor within the life of a community, or those that are more pilgrim. And they use the language of pilgrim to say that there are particular people journeying together. And that particularity may be out of tradition, it may be out of ethnicity, maybe out of heritage. There are a lot of ways to see how pilgrims sort of organize themselves. And there are some churches that just sort of model their lives as a servant beyond themselves. And they really do think of the totality of their personality in these kinds of categories. In our class, we'll have an article also that unpacks these categories and uses, really 4 large perspectives and 8 categories. I'm really providing these so you can just say, in a way, what would your church, how would you characterize your church and its personality? Not caricature, but at least have a sense of the whole of what sort of best describes what that congregation's discipleship is about. And what difference does that make when you try to think about discipleship? So as the course goes along, you'll be engaged both in the inside out as well as the outside in components. Now, the challenge of this class then ultimately is to try to enter into the life of that church and capture the thick description of the local discipleship by wandering around inside the life of that church, and yes, identifying programs and thinking about the processes, and in some ways connecting the intricacy of that church as best as you can in light of discipleship through formation and discipleship language. So that's our major hermeneutical lens, if you will, but we're just trying to get a good sense of that. And then trying to see how that church's family resemblance might compare to other congregations. Just trying to go, well, if this works in this church in this way, does it tend to fit with a given group of churches that really are similar in how they're related, sort of familial to each other? Now, once you've kind of done that, and that'll be the first part of the class, we will kind of move to a sort of promontory, kind of step back a little bit and evaluate how that church is engaged in light of a kind of faithful view of discipleship from a biblical and historical perspective. Now, I will say there is no perfect church. It's really saying, how can we help a church become more faithful instead of thinking of a church not being faithful at all? So don't think of bad to good, but just think about faithful to more faithful. And I think all churches attempt a level of faithfulness, and we're just trying to think in light of sort of our own sort of theology and that we'll be embracing as the class unfolds, that we can offer something that just deepen that faithfulness within that congregation. And we'll do that by envisioning strategies that will move the church in the right direction. And those moves may be large, you may propose big strategies, or sometimes they may be very subtle, just things of nuancing some of the processes. But if you have captured the thick description and you have a kind of sense of the whole of that church, then as you make your argument for the strategies, they make sense. They'll make sense not only in the class, but they'll also make sense to that congregation. And as a pastor, that's what you want to see happen. So we'll be moving into that large process. But beyond this context, what else will we be doing in the class? Well, we will be engaged in both understanding the history and theology of discipleship. What does faithfulness look like in light of the history of the church and in light of our theological convictions? We'll also pay attention to people. We'll pay attention to core issues around developmental theory, how people grow and who they are and their faith. And we will think about age level ministry, though this course is not designed to be primarily an age level approach, but we'll attend to that since many of our churches still embrace different types of ministry based on where people are on the life course. Then we'll wrestle with what it means to organize discipleship and to administer that. And we'll deal with some key questions around legal issues in and through our reading. But ultimately, we'll kind of conclude the class by just thinking about general strategies that definitely do promote discipleship within the church. Really, this whole class starts with the process of discerning our location. This is why I want you to name a church location very early. And do think about that thick description before you recommend any program implementation. But you might want to think about some programs to add before it's over. Just remember that programs are words, but also be looking for the grammar of discipleship, how those different programs connect to each other. So we'll be thinking about the process, always in dialogue with that context, and we'll be filtering it in at least through Edie and Lamport or Dr. Maddox in my book as kind of big categories, or you may choose other ones before it's over. We will take time to wrestle with the philosophy or the theology of that church. How does that church's approach affirm or challenge even your own implicit theology of discipleship? And you may be surprised in some ways in which a congregation at times affirms what you think it makes for faithful discipleship, but at other times challenges it. And how do you grow in dialogue with that context, even as you're calling that context, that church, to grow as well? And we will engage in the personality. And so I want you to begin thinking about that. Again, always in dialogue with what's going on and in dialogue with what we'll be reading. So what is the general way your church approaches discipleship? And don't be too quick to name that. But if you could even begin, as this lecture is ending, to be thinking about, the programs that you need to begin to identify, the processes, sort of thinking about what might be that underlying theology or philosophy, and what is that personality already? How would you characterize it? Even if it's just naming it as a suburban versus an inner city, it's a beginning point as we begin in this class. And then we'll keep working on it as we go. Remember that ultimately that discernment lends to a strategy. And when it comes to that, what we'll be doing by the end of the semester is presenting that strategy. And what we'll be doing is trying to understand that congregation so that it helps us to participate with the church in such a way that as a pastor, we can help that church in its discipleship focus. That's the goal of what we're trying to accomplish. So we'll be using the categories to help think through the issues and creating a plan for congregational discipleship. And I want you to understand that the plan you'll be doing, I hope, will make a difference in that church. But that presentation, I do hope you can take with you, if nothing more than as a template, so that, it might fit other congregations that are of a similar family resemblance. And by working the steps, at least you have a way that should you move from one church to another, you can sort of rework the process. Just remember that whatever you propose, it's deeply connected to the context. And in doing so, no one size fits all churches. This is one thing you'll hear me stress as the semester goes. We take a very large descriptive approach because there is no one perfect approach to discipleship. There are some that are more faithful than others, but hopefully by the time you're done with this class, you can basically be able to do two things. Both, can you respond to a particular congregation and that the strategy that you create makes a difference there, but can you also generalize enough that you could at least help other congregations with a family resemblance? And I will go ahead and say, and if you move into a church that really looks different, you could replicate this process again, utilizing the tools from this course without necessarily having to be stuck within a given family resemblance for the totality of your ministry. Well, I hope this orientation has been helpful. Look forward to our engagement online and look forward to seeing you at points, and not in this class and other classes, but also hearing from you in our online engagement. Blessings to you. Take care.